Tonight, we're going to talk about a story that begins with a small band of wandering horsemen and ends with one of the greatest empires the world has ever known. A story that stretches across 600 years, 3 continents, and countless generations of sultans, soldiers, poets, and dreamers. So settle in, get comfortable, close your eyes if you'd like, and let this quiet voice carry you gently through the centuries. There is no hurry tonight. We have all the time in the world. Our journey does not begin in a marble palace. It does not begin on a golden throne or beneath the great dome of a mosque. It begins far away, on the vast, wind-swept grasslands of Central Asia, long before anyone had ever heard the name Ottoman. Long before Constantinople had become Istanbul. Long before the crescent moon had ever flown above the walls of Vienna. It begins with a simple people called the Turks. Nomads who moved with their herds across an endless sea of grass, following the seasons, riding small, hardy horses, sleeping in round felt tents called yurts. They were skilled hunters and patient herders. They were fierce warriors when they had to be. But mostly, they simply want a place to graze their animals and raise their families in peace beneath the wide, open sky. For centuries, these Turkic tribes lived far from the great empires of the world. Rome rose and fell without ever touching them. Persia sent its armies against many enemies, but rarely against them. They were a people of the steppe, of long silences and cold winters and campfires under the stars. But around the year 1000, something began to change. The climate grew a little colder. The grasslands began to shrink. Rival tribes pressed in from every side, competing for shrinking pastures and dwindling water. And so, slowly, generation by generation, the Turks began to move, westward, always westward, searching for kinder weather, greener valleys, and lands where their people could survive. Along the way, they encountered a new faith. Islam had spread across the Middle East over the previous centuries, carried by merchants and scholars and armies alike. And as the Turkic tribes moved through Persia and the highlands of Central Asia, they embraced it. They became Muslim, though they kept many of their old ways as well. Their language, their poetry, their love of horses and open country. Islam gave them something new, a shared identity, a shared purpose, a sense that their long westward journey was not simply a wandering, but a mission of some deeper meaning. By the 11th century, one great branch of these Turks, known as the Seljuks, had built a mighty empire of their own. Their power stretched from Central Asia all the way to the borders of the Byzantine world. And in the year 1071, they met the Byzantines in a great battle at a place called Manzikert on the eastern edge of Anatolia. The Byzantines were the last surviving heirs of Rome. Their emperor rode at the head of a proud, professional army. On paper, it was a battle the Turks should have lost. But something went wrong for the Byzantines that day. Their lines broke. Their emperor was captured, and the Seljuk Turks poured through the gates of Anatolia, the land we now call Turkey. A door had been opened, and it would never fully close again. Over the next 2 centuries, waves of Turkish tribes settled across Anatolia. They built villages, cleared fields, raised mosques and caravanserais. They mixed with the Greek, Armenian and Persian peoples who already lived there. They learned new crafts. They forgot some of their old ones. Slowly, patiently, they transformed the region into something entirely new. A frontier. A meeting place between the ancient Christian empires of the East and the young, restless Turkish clans still arriving from the steppes. It was a place of opportunity, a place of quiet villages and busy markets, of small wars and shifting alliances. And it was here, on this in-between land, that our real story finally begins. Let me take you now to the late 1200s. The Seljuk Empire, once so mighty, has grown old and weak. It has been battered by a terrible new force from the east. The Mongols. Under Genghis Khan and his sons, the Mongols swept across Asia like a great winter storm. They shattered kingdoms. They burned cities. They left ruin behind them wherever they rode. And when they reached Anatolia in the 1240s, they crushed the Seljuk army at a battle called Kurs Dag. The Seljuk Sultanate did not vanish overnight. It lingered on for a while, growing more and more feeble, more and more of a shadow. But its real power was gone. Across Anatolia, the old order simply melted away. In the space left behind by the Seljuks, dozens of small Turkish principalities emerged. Each was ruled by a chieftain called a bey who commanded a small band of warriors, and controlled a modest patch of land. These little states were called beyliks. Most of them would never amount to much. Most of them would be conquered by their neighbors, or absorbed by larger powers, or simply forgotten by history. But one of them, a small, obscure beylik on the far northwestern edge of Anatolia, would grow into something extraordinary, something no one at the time could possibly have imagined. That beylik was ruled by a family from the Kei tribe, and the head of that family, around the year 1280, was a man named Ertugrul. Very little is known about Ertugrul with any real certainty. Later Ottoman chroniclers would weave grand legends around him, painting him as a mighty warrior and a wise chieftain. But the actual historical record is very thin. What we do know is this. He led his small clan into a corner of northwestern Anatolia, near the shrinking Byzantine frontier, and there he settled. His people herded sheep and goats. They rode their horses across quiet green hills. They lived a life not so different from their ancestors on the Central Asian steppe. Simple, modest, careful, watchful, and it was Ertugrul's son who would change everything. His name was Osman, and from Osman would come the very word Ottoman. Osman was born, according to tradition, around 1258. He grew up on the frontier, listening to the stories of old men, watching Byzantine towers glinting in the distance, learning the patient skills of a warrior chieftain. When his father Ertugrul died, sometime around 1280, Osman inherited leadership of the small Kei clan. He was not the ruler of anything grand. He commanded perhaps a few thousand people. His territory covered a few hundred square miles at most. In the great sweep of history, he should have been forgotten. Just another minor warlord in a quiet corner of Anatolia. But Osman had something the others did not. He had patience. He had a keen eye for weakness in his neighbors. He knew when to fight and when to make peace. He treated his followers with fairness and generosity, and they repaid him with fierce, quiet loyalty. And here is the part that is often forgotten. He also treated the local Christian peasants of the region with a gentleness that surprised them. He offered them lower taxes than the Byzantines had demanded. He offered them protection from bandits. He offered them peace, as long as they accepted his rule. Many of them did. And so his little state began to grow, not only through the sword, but through the simple, quiet acceptance of the people who lived on the land. The Ottomans, in later centuries, would tell a beautiful story about young Osman, a story of a dream. It is said that one night, while staying in the home of a holy man named Sheikh Edebali, Osman had a vision. In the dream, a great tree grew from his own chest. Its branches spread across the world, sheltering 3 continents. Its leaves became like scimitars, gleaming in the sun. Rivers flowed from its roots, watering great cities. When Osman awoke, Sheikh Edebali listened to the dream, and then he smiled gently and said, "Your descendants will rule an empire greater than any the world has ever known." Whether the dream truly happened, no one can say, but it captures something real about what came next. In 1302, Osman fought a small but famous battle against a Byzantine force at a place called Baphius. It was not a great clash of armies, perhaps a few thousand warriors on each side, but Osman won, and that quiet victory sent a ripple through the region. Suddenly, Turkish warriors from all across Anatolia began to hear of this chieftain named Osman, this bey who was winning battles against the mighty Byzantines. They packed their belongings, saddled their horses, and rode northwest to join his banner. His army grew, his territory grew, his reputation grew, and still he remained patient. His great dream was the city of Bursa. Bursa was a wealthy Byzantine town at the foot of the Uludag mountain, right in the heart of the lands the Ottomans hoped one day to claim. It was well fortified. It was well defended. Taking it by direct assault would have been almost impossible for such a small beylik. So Osman did something remarkable. He did not attack. Instead, he surrounded it, slowly, over many years. He built small forts along the roads leading to the city. He cut off its supplies. He waited, and he waited, and he waited some more. Osman himself would not live to see the fall of Bursa. In the early 1320s, the Aging chieftain grew ill. He handed leadership of the beylik to his son, Orhan. And in the year 1326, after decades of patient encirclement, Bursa finally opened its gates and surrendered. It became the first true capital of the Ottoman state. Osman died around the same time, or shortly after, and was buried in that beautiful city. His tomb still stands there today, a quiet place, a modest resting place for the man whose name would one day echo across 600 years of history. And so, as our first quiet chapter draws to a close, we see the earliest shape of the Ottoman story. A wandering clan from the Central Asian steppe, a patient chieftain named Osman, a small victory at Baphius, a dream of a great tree, and a beautiful, hard-won city called Bursa. These were the seeds, small, humble, easy to overlook. But from them would grow one of the mightiest empires the world has ever seen. In our next chapter, we will follow the story onward, into the long reign of Osman's son Orhan, and beyond, as the tiny Beylik begins to transform itself into something entirely new. For now, let your thoughts settle. Let the world slow. Let the sound of hooves on distant grasslands fade gently into the quiet. Tonight, we continue our quiet journey through the long centuries of the Ottoman story. In our last chapter, we left old Osman resting beneath the earth of Bursa, the little hill city his patient siege had finally won. His son, Orhan, now stood at the head of the growing Beylik, and though the world outside barely noticed the change, everything was about to shift. Let your shoulders soften, let your breathing slow, and let us return, gently, to those green Anatolian hills, where the sound of horses moved through the mist of early morning. Orhan was not a young man when he became Bey. He had already spent many years riding beside his father, learning the slow craft of frontier warfare, learning when to press forward and when to hold back. He had inherited his father's patience, but he had also inherited his father's boldness. And now, with Bursa in his hands, he began to dream a little bigger. He looked out across the misty hills of northwestern Anatolia, and he saw not just one city, but a country waiting to be gathered. The Byzantine Empire, once the mightiest realm in all of Christendom, was by now only a shadow of what it had been. Its rulers quarreled in the great palaces of Constantinople. Its provinces slipped one by one from its grasp. Its armies were smaller each year, its treasury emptier, its walls in need of repair. To a patient chieftain like Orhan, it looked less like an empire and more like a great old tree, rotten inside, waiting for a gentle push. And so, through the 1330s, Orhan pressed carefully forward. He took the city of Nicaea, called Iznik by the Turks, in 1331. He took Nicomedia, called Izmit, a few years later. Each of these had once been proud, important Byzantine cities, filled with ancient churches and grand markets. Now they belonged to the young Ottoman state, and Orhan, wisely, did not destroy them. He kept the old buildings. He allowed the Christian population to remain, to keep their faith, to keep their homes. He simply became their new ruler and asked, in return, for peace and taxes and quiet loyalty. Something remarkable was happening in these early years. Orhan was beginning to build not just an army, but a state. A structured, thinking, remembering state. He created a system of laws, drawn from Islamic tradition, but flexible enough to include the many different peoples who lived under his rule. He minted the first Ottoman coins, small silver pieces called aks, stamped with his name. He built mosques, but he also allowed churches to remain. He built schools called medreses, where scholars gathered to teach the Quran, mathematics, poetry, and philosophy. Bursa, the first Ottoman capital, began to bloom into a true city. Green domes rose above its rooftops. Fountains ran cold and clear in its streets. Merchants came from as far as Persia and Egypt to trade in its bazaars. The little frontier Beylik was slowly becoming something grander. And then, around the middle of the 1300s, something happened that would change the Ottoman story forever. Orhan crossed the water. For years, the Ottomans had gazed across the narrow strip of sea that separated Asia from Europe. On the other side lay Thrace. Beyond that lay the Balkans. Beyond that, all of Europe, with its castles and cathedrals and endless kingdoms. To cross into Europe was to step into a whole new world. It was to leave behind the familiar hills of Anatolia and enter the ancient lands of Rome and Greece. And in 1354, an opportunity came. A great earthquake shook the region, damaging the walls of a small Byzantine fort called Gallipoli on the European side of the Dardanelles. The Ottomans, led by Orhan's son Suleiman, seized the moment. They crossed the water, walked into the ruined town and stayed. They repaired the walls. They settled Turkish families in the region. They did not leave. And so, without a great battle, without a grand declaration, the Ottomans had taken their first foothold in Europe. They would never let it go. Orhan died in 1362, an old man by then, having ruled for more than 35 years. He had transformed his father's small beylik into a real state, straddling two continents, respected by neighbors, feared by rivals. He was buried beside his father in Bursa, in the quiet hillside tomb complex that still stands today. His son, Murad, now took up the reins, and Murad, though we do not often speak his name today, would be one of the great architects of the Ottoman Empire. Murad I was a serious, thoughtful man. He had grown up watching his father build a state, and he understood, in his bones, that an army alone would not be enough to hold what had been won. He needed institutions. He needed a system that could survive beyond any single ruler. And so, during his long reign, Murad quietly built the framework that the empire would rest upon for centuries to come. He organized the Ottoman government into a proper court, with viziers or ministers who advised him on matters of law and war and finance. He created the first Ottoman standing army, paid soldiers who served the Sultan year-round, not just seasonal warriors who came and went. And he did something even more remarkable. He created a new kind of soldier, unlike anything the world had ever seen. These were the Janissaries. The Janissaries were young men, taken as boys from Christian families in the Balkans, brought to the Sultan's household, raised as Muslims, trained from childhood as elite soldiers, and given a life of discipline, education, and comfort in exchange for absolute loyalty to the Sultan. It was a strange system, and by modern eyes, a troubling one. But in its own time, it was extraordinarily effective. These boys grew up as brothers of the sword. They had no other family. They had no other loyalty. They lived in barracks, prayed together, ate together, marched together. And on the battlefield, they were terrifying. Disciplined where other armies were wild. Steady where other armies scattered. In their tall white caps and long dark coats, the Janissaries would become the most feared infantry in the world for the next 3 centuries. Murad used his growing power carefully. He pushed westward, into the Balkans, into Bulgaria, into Serbia, into Macedonia. City after city fell to him, some by battle, some by treaty. He captured the great city of Edirne, called Adrianople by the Byzantines, and made it his new capital. Edirne was closer to Europe than Bursa. It sat astride the great roads leading into the Balkans. From here, Murad could look outward at the world he wished to shape, but not every conquest came easily. In the spring of 1389, Murad rode north with his army to face a great alliance of Balkan Christian princes. The Serbian Prince Lazar had gathered knights from Serbia, Bosnia, Wallachia, Albania, and beyond. They met on a broad plain in Kosovo called the Field of Blackbirds. The battle that followed was long and terrible. Both sides fought with courage. Both sides suffered tremendous losses. When the dust settled, the Ottomans had won. But the price was almost unbearable. Prince Lazar was killed. Half of the Serbian nobility lay dead upon the field. And Sultan Murad himself, walking among the fallen after the battle, was struck down by a wounded Serbian noble named Miloš Obilić. According to legend, Miloš pretended to be a deserter, asked to kiss the Sultan's hand, and drew a hidden dagger. Murad died there on the field, on the day of his greatest victory. He was buried in part, right there on the plain of Kosovo, where a small monument still stands to this day. The crown then passed to Murad's son, Bayezid. And Bayezid was a different kind of man altogether. Fierce, quick-tempered, brilliant in battle. His soldiers called him Yildirim, which means the thunderbolt, and a thunderbolt he was. Within days of his father's death on the field of Kosovo, Bayezid had secured his throne and turned his army toward new conquests. He drove north through Bulgaria, sweeping away what remained of the old kingdoms there. He crossed the Danube. He raided into Hungary. He turned back east and swallowed one Anatolian beylik after another, unifying most of what is now Turkey under Ottoman rule. In just a few short years, he had doubled the size of the empire. His speed alarmed the courts of Europe. In 1496, a great crusade was called against him. Knights from France, Germany, Hungary, and beyond gathered under the banner of King Sigismund of Hungary. They marched down the Danube, singing songs of glory, dreaming of driving the Ottomans back into Asia. They met Bayezid's army at a place called Nicopolis, on the banks of that great river in the year 1396. It was a proud, glittering army, perhaps the greatest crusading force since the days of the early Holy Land expeditions. But Bayezid was ready. His janissaries stood firm behind rows of sharpened stakes. His cavalry waited in the folds of the hills. And when the French knights charged, in their heavy armor and beautiful banners, they charged straight into disaster. By the end of the day, the crusading army had been destroyed. Thousands were killed. Thousands more were taken prisoner. The dream of driving the Ottomans out of Europe died on that riverbank. Bayezid seemed unstoppable now. He turned his eyes toward the last great prize, Constantinople, the ancient capital of the Byzantines, the city of Constantine. The city with the greatest walls in all the world. He began to besiege it. He built a fortress on the Bosphorus to cut off its supplies. He waited for the old city to fall into his hands like ripe fruit. It seemed only a matter of time. But history, as always, had other plans. Far to the east, another storm was gathering. A conqueror from the steppes of Central Asia, a man of terrible power and greater ambition. His name was Timur. And when Timur turned his gaze westward, toward Bayezid and the Ottomans, the young empire would face its very first great catastrophe. But that is a tale for our next quiet chapter. For now, let the story rest. Let the field of Kosovo fade gently. Let the walls of Constantinople dim in your mind. Let your breath slow, your thoughts drift, your body soften into the darkness of a peaceful night. Tonight, we return to our long and gentle journey through the story of the Ottomans. In our last chapter, we left the young empire at what seemed to be a moment of triumph. Sultan Bayezid the Thunderbolt had crushed the great crusade at Nicopolis. He had swallowed most of Anatolia. He was tightening his grip around the ancient walls of Constantinople. Everything, it seemed, was going his way. But history rarely runs in a straight line. And far to the east, a storm was rising. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts settle. And let us turn our eyes now toward the endless plains of Central Asia, where a new conqueror was preparing to march. His name was Timur. In the west, he would come to be known as Tamerlane. He had been born, according to tradition, in the year 1336 in a small town in what is now Uzbekistan. He came from a modest Turkic Mongol family, a minor noble, nothing more. As a young man, he had been wounded in a raid, leaving him lame in one leg for the rest of his life. His enemies mocked him for it, calling him Timur the Lame. He took the name and wore it like a crown. From this small, limping beginning, Timur rose to become one of the most terrifying conquerors the world has ever known. By the year 1400, Timur ruled an empire that stretched from the borders of China to the mountains of Persia. He had shattered the last remnants of the Mongol Khanates. He had sacked Delhi and left tens of thousands of skulls piled outside its gates. He had crushed the Golden Horde. He had burned Damascus. He was old now, past 60, but his ambition burned as fiercely as ever. And in his final years, he turned his terrible attention westward, toward Anatolia, toward the Ottomans, toward Bayezid the Thunderbolt. The two men had already exchanged letters, each more insulting than the last. Bayezid, proud and quick-tempered, boasted of his victories and mocked Timur's crude origins. Timur, patient and cold, wrote back with cutting elegance, reminding Bayezid that empires can rise and fall in a single afternoon. Small Turkish princes, exiled by Bayezid's conquests, fled to Timur's court and begged him to intervene. And so, in the summer of 1402, the old conqueror marched. His army was vast, perhaps 200,000 men. War elephants brought all the way from India, skilled horse archers, siege engineers. Bayezid, gathering his own great army, rode east to meet him. The two forces met on a broad, dusty plain near the city of Ankara on the 28th of July, 1402. It was a burning hot day. Bayezid had chosen his ground poorly. His men were tired from a long march. There was little water in the streams nearby, and when the battle began, things quickly went wrong. Whole units of Turkish warriors, men who had once served princes that Bayezid had conquered, switched sides in the middle of the fight. They rode over to Timur's banners. The Ottoman line began to crack. The Janissaries fought bravely. Bayezid himself fought at the head of his household guard, his sword rising and falling until his arm grew heavy. But it was not enough. By the end of that terrible day, the Ottoman army was destroyed. And Sultan Bayezid, the mighty Thunderbolt, had been captured alive. There is a famous story about what happened next. Timur is said to have kept Bayezid in a small iron cage, dragging him along wherever the Mongol camp moved. Later historians have debated whether the cage was truly a cage, or perhaps just a covered litter. But either way, the humiliation was total. The proud sultan, who had once thundered across Europe, now sat as a prisoner in the tent of an old, limping conqueror. Bayezid did not survive long. He died in captivity in the spring of 1403, some say of grief, some say of illness, some say by his own hand. He was carried back to Bursa and buried among his ancestors. His empire, so carefully built by his fathers and grandfathers, seemed to lie in ruins around him. For the young Ottoman state, this was a catastrophe. Timur did not stay in Anatolia. He was old, and his eyes were turning toward China. But before he left, he did something clever and cruel. He divided the Ottoman lands among Bayezid's 4 surviving sons, each of whom he gave a small piece of the shattered empire. Then he rode away, satisfied that the Ottomans would never rise again. And for a while, it seemed he was right. The years that followed are known as the Ottoman Interregnum. It was a time of civil war, brother against brother, cousin against cousin. Bayezid's sons, Suleiman, Issa, Mehmed, and Musa, each claimed the throne. Each ruled a different piece of what had once been a single empire. They fought each other across Anatolia and the Balkans. They made alliances and broke them. They betrayed each other in dark tents by candlelight. Villages that had known peace under Murad and Bayezid now saw armies march through their fields again and again. For 11 long years, the Ottoman state might have vanished entirely. But history has its favorites, and the Ottomans, it seemed, were not yet ready to be forgotten. Slowly, patiently, the youngest of Bayezid's sons, Mehmed, began to gather the pieces. He was quieter than his brothers, less flashy, less proud. But he had inherited something of his great-grandfather Osman's steady patience. He built alliances with local lords. He earned the loyalty of the Janissaries. He fought his brothers one after another in a series of bitter campaigns. By the year 1413, he stood alone. All his brothers were dead, and the Ottoman Empire, battered but whole, belonged once again to a single ruler. He is remembered as Mehmed I, sometimes called the Restorer, because that is exactly what he was. He restored a broken thing to life. Mehmed ruled for only 8 years. He was not a great conqueror. He fought no famous battles. He did not add much new territory to the empire. But he did something perhaps even more important. He healed it. He rebuilt trust between the different peoples living under Ottoman rule. He rebuilt the army. He rebuilt the treasury. He calmed the countryside. When he died in 1421, still a young man, he left behind an empire that was once again strong, once again peaceful, once again ready to look outward at the world. He is buried in a beautiful little tomb complex in Bursa called the Green Tomb, or Yeşil Tuğ. It is one of the loveliest places in all of Turkey. Small, modest, covered in beautiful blue and green tiles, a perfect resting place for a modest, healing king. His son, Murad II, took the throne next, and Murad II is one of the most interesting figures in this whole long story. He was, by all accounts, a gentle and thoughtful man. He loved poetry. He loved gardens. He loved the company of scholars and mystics. He read deeply from the works of Sufi masters. He would have been perfectly content, one senses, to spend his days in quiet study, sipping coffee, listening to the wind in the trees of his palace garden. But he had inherited an empire, and an empire in those years did not leave its ruler in peace. Murad II spent much of his long reign fighting reluctantly but skillfully. He put down rebellions in Anatolia. He fought crusades in the Balkans. He faced a truly formidable Christian coalition led by the great Hungarian general János Hunyadi, and he defeated it, though barely, at the Battle of Varna in 1444. That battle is one of the great turning points of the age. The last serious crusade against the Ottomans was broken. The dream of driving them out of Europe faded, and would not seriously return for many centuries. Murad, weary and grief-stricken by all the killing, actually tried to retire twice. He handed the throne to his young son and went off to a quiet estate to read and pray. But each time, the empire called him back. Crises would flare, and Murad would sigh, put down his books, mount his horse, and ride once more to war. That young son of his, the one to whom he passed the throne twice, was named Mehmed. And this boy, this small, quiet, watchful boy, would grow into one of the most extraordinary rulers in all of world history. He is the maimed we now call the Conqueror. Mehmed II, Fatih Sultan Mehmed, as he is remembered in Turkish. He is the one who would finally do what so many sultans before him had dreamed of doing. He would take Constantinople. When Mehmed came fully to the throne in 1451, after the death of his father Murad, he was only 19 years old. The courts of Europe scarcely paid attention. Another young sultan, they thought. Another boy who would soon be pushed aside by his elders. They could not have been more wrong. Mehmed had spent his entire boyhood studying the great walls of Constantinople. He spoke 6 languages. He read Greek philosophy. He read Islamic theology. He studied the campaigns of Alexander the Great and of Julius Caesar, sometimes said to have carried a small book of their lives with him wherever he went. He was patient. He was disciplined. He was quietly certain that Constantinople would fall to him, and he began, immediately, to prepare. The city of Constantinople had stood for more than 1,000 years. Its great walls, built by the Emperor Theodosius in the 5th century, had turned back army after army. Persians, Arabs, Bulgarians, Rus, countless would-be conquerors had broken themselves upon those walls. The city sat behind 3 lines of stone and brick, moats and towers, a masterpiece of ancient engineering. To take it seemed almost impossible, but Mehmed had something no earlier conqueror had possessed. He had gunpowder. He had cannons. He had, in particular, one enormous cannon of a size the world had never seen before, cast for him by a Hungarian engineer named Orban. And with that great cannon rolling slowly toward the city and an army of 80,000 men marching behind it, the last chapter of the ancient Byzantine world was about to begin. In our next chapter, we will stand together upon the walls of Constantinople in the spring of 1453, and we will watch, quietly, as one age ends and another begins. For now, let the sounds of hooves and horns fade gently. Let your breath deepen. Let the night carry you softly towards sleep. Tonight, we return to the walls of a great and ancient city. In our last chapter, we watched a young sultan, Mehmed II, gather his armies and his cannons and his patient dreams. We watched him ride slowly toward the mightiest fortress in the medieval world. And now, we stand together on the edge of one of the great turning points in all of human history. Take a slow breath. Let your body soften. And let us step back, quietly, into the spring of 1453 on the shores of the Bosphorus. Constantinople, in those days, was already a ghost of what it had once been. The city that had once held 1,000,000 souls now held perhaps 50,000. Whole neighborhoods stood empty. Grand palaces sagged with age. Weeds grew between the stones of ancient plazas. The great church of Hagia Sophia, built by the Emperor Justinian 9 centuries earlier, still rose above the city like a mountain of marble and gold. But its congregations were small, its priests few. The Byzantine Empire, once the greatest realm in Christendom, now consisted of little more than this single city, a few nearby villages, and a small holding in Greece called the Mora. Its emperor, a good and brave man named Constantine XI, ruled over a shrinking world. He knew the storm was coming. He had known for years. Mehmed had begun his preparations long before the siege itself. In the summer of 1452, he had built an enormous fortress on the European side of the Bosphorus, at the narrowest point of the strait. It was called Rumeli Hisari, the fortress of Europe. It stood only a few miles north of Constantinople, and from its walls, Ottoman cannons could sink any ship trying to bring supplies down from the Black Sea. The Byzantines had watched it go up, stone by stone, and they had known what it meant. Their city was being sealed. Their supply lines were being cut. The great siege had already begun in a quiet, patient way before a single shot had been fired. By early April of 1453, Mehmed's main army had arrived. Perhaps 80,000 men, perhaps more. They spread across the fields outside the great land walls of the city, tents stretching to the horizon in every direction. Horses, camels, oxen dragging siege engines. And rolling slowly forward, drawn by teams of 60 oxen and pulled along by 200 men, came the great cannon of Orban, the bronze giant, 27 feet long, firing stone balls the size of small barrels. Its roar, when finally it spoke, would shake windows miles away. Inside the city, the defenders numbered perhaps 7,000, perhaps 8, a tiny force by any measure. They were Greeks mostly, but also Genoese and Venetian volunteers who had come to help defend Christendom's oldest city. Their leader, alongside the emperor, was a brave Genoese soldier named Giovanni Giustiniani, a professional captain who knew everything there was to know about siege warfare. He organized the defense with quiet skill. He assigned men to each stretch of wall. He repaired weak spots. He stockpiled food. He blessed the great chain that stretched across the mouth of the Golden Horn, the deep harbor of the city, keeping enemy ships out. And he prepared his men, calmly, for what was about to come. The bombardment began in the second week of April. The great cannon fired only 7 or 8 times a day. It was slow to load. It sometimes cracked from the heat. But when it spoke, sections of ancient Roman wall crumbled like dry bread. Smaller cannons, dozens of them, kept up a steady thunder from dawn to dusk. The walls, which had turned back so many armies for so many centuries, began at last to crack. The defenders worked through every night, filling the gaps with timber, barrels of earth and rubble. Sometimes the Sultan's men would attack at dawn, hopping to catch them exhausted. Sometimes at midnight, hopping to catch them asleep. But every time the defenders somehow held. Constantine walked the walls himself, in his simple armor, encouraging the men, thanking them, weeping quietly with them when close friends fell. Weeks passed. Then came a day of small miracles for the defenders. 3 Genoese ships and 1 Byzantine grain ship appeared on the horizon, sailing hard for the city with vital supplies. Mehmed's fleet moved to intercept them, hundreds of galleys against just 4 ships. The battle at sea was fierce, but the tall Christian ships, with their skilled crews and higher decks, fought off wave after wave of Ottoman galleys. As the wind carried them safely into the Golden Horn, cheers rose from the walls of the city. Inside his tent, Mehmed reportedly rode his horse into the surf, screaming with rage. His fleet had failed him, but Mehmed was not a man to be defeated by a single setback. That very night, he ordered one of the most astonishing feats of the entire siege. If he could not sail his ships into the Golden Horn past the Great Chain, then he would carry them over the land instead. His engineers laid down a road of greased logs across the hills behind the Genoese suburb of Galata. And in a single night, 70 Ottoman ships were dragged up out of the water, over the hills, and back down into the Golden Horn. The defenders woke the next morning to see a fleet suddenly floating in a harbor they had thought was safe. It was a psychological blow of tremendous weight. The defenders now had to spread themselves even thinner, guarding sea walls that had once been protected by the chain. The siege ground on. May began. The walls grew weaker. The defenders grew more exhausted. Food began to run short. Rumors of a great Christian fleet coming to their rescue drifted through the city, but no fleet ever appeared. In the papal courts of Rome, in the merchant halls of Venice, men spoke of sending help, but none of it arrived in time. Constantinople stood alone. By the last week of May, Mehmed had made his final decision. The general assault would come on the 29th. He gathered his commanders in his great tent by candlelight, and he told them what would happen. The attack would begin in the darkness before dawn. Wave after wave of soldiers would be thrown against the walls, at every gate, at every breach, without pause, without rest, until either the city fell or every Ottoman soldier lay dead. He promised his men the traditional right of 3 days of plunder if they succeeded. Then he sent word into the city, offering Constantine one last chance. Surrender, and he could keep his life and his family. He could rule as a vassal in the Mora. Refuse, and there would be no more mercy. Constantine gave his answer with quiet grace. He said that he could not surrender the city given into his keeping by God. He would die at his post. That last night in Constantinople is one of the most beautiful and heartbreaking scenes in all of history. On the walls, exhausted men worked to patch the breaches by torchlight. In the streets, all the icons of the city were gathered up and carried in a great procession, Greeks and Latins walking together, Catholic and Orthodox singing side by side, old rivalries forgotten in the face of what was coming. In Hagia Sophia, a final service was held. Constantine attended, kneeling before the altar, taking communion for the last time. Then he embraced his companions, asked forgiveness of anyone he had wronged, and rode back to the walls. Outside the city, Mehmed's army waited in silence. Great bonfires burned. Priests and imams chanted prayers. The night was still and warm. Then the drums began. The assault came in three great waves. The first was made up of irregulars, poorly trained but numerous, sent forward to tire the defenders. They died in their thousands, cut down by arrows and stones and small cannon fire from the walls. Then came the Anatolian troops, more disciplined, more skilled. They pressed harder. They came closer, but still the walls held. And then in the last darkness before dawn, Mehmed sent forward his janissaries, his elite, his household, the finest infantry in the world. They came forward slowly, silently, in perfect order, and then all at once, with a roar, they crashed into the walls. At some point in the fury, near the small Kerkeporter gate, someone forgot to close it. Perhaps it had been left open by defenders coming back from a sally. Perhaps in the smoke and confusion no one saw it. A small band of janissaries slipped inside. They climbed to the top of one of the towers and raised the Ottoman flag. And when the defenders saw that flag flying above their own walls, something broke inside them. At almost the same moment, Giovanni Giustiniani, fighting brilliantly along the main breach, was wounded by a musket ball. He was carried from the wall, dying. His men, seeing their leader gone, wavered. The line began to give way. The Emperor Constantine saw it happen. He knew in that moment that the city was lost. He tore off the imperial insignia from his armor so that he would not be captured as a prize. He drew his sword, and with his last companions around him, he charged into the mass of Ottoman soldiers streaming through the breach. He was never seen again. No one is entirely sure how he died. His body was never certainly identified. He passed into legend, into the quiet dreams of a lost empire. Somewhere in that dawn, 1,000 years of Roman rule ended with the death of a good man in a broken wall. By the middle of the morning, Constantinople had fallen. Ottoman soldiers poured through the streets. There was terrible violence, as there always is when a great city falls after a long siege. Churches were plundered. Homes were broken open. Many were killed. Many more were taken as slaves. But by the afternoon, Mehmed himself rode into the city. And what he did next is worth remembering. He ordered the killing to stop. He walked into Hagia Sophia, that great church, and he stood beneath its enormous dome. He is said to have wept quietly at the sight of its beauty. Then he called for a prayer, and Hagia Sophia became a mosque. But Mehmed also protected the city's remaining Christians. He appointed a new Orthodox patriarch. He allowed the Jewish community to continue. He invited Greeks and Armenians and Italians to remain, to trade, to live under his rule. He would rebuild Constantinople, he declared, into a capital greater than any the world had known. He was 21 years old. In our next chapter, we will walk with young Mehmed through the wounded streets of his new capital, and we will watch as one of history's greatest cities begins its second life, this time as Istanbul, the beating heart of a rising empire. For now, let the ancient walls stand quietly in the mist of memory. Let your breath slow. Let your body settle. Let sleep gather you gently in its arms. Tonight, we return to the shores of the Bosphorus, where a great city stands wounded but alive after a terrible spring. In our last chapter, we watched young Mehmed the Conqueror walk into the fallen capital of the Byzantines, weeping quietly beneath the dome of Hagia Sophia, ordering the killing to stop, dreaming already of what this city might become. Now, we join him in the years that follow, as an old Roman capital is slowly, patiently reborn as the beating heart of a rising empire. Let your breathing slow. Let your shoulders soften. And let us walk together through the quiet streets of a new Istanbul. Mehmed's first task in the summer of 1453 was simply to bring people back. The city was half empty. Whole neighborhoods stood abandoned. He needed traders, craftsmen, farmers, scholars, priests, imams, sailors, builders. And so he sent out invitations across his growing empire. He offered land. He offered tax breaks. He offered protection. He brought Greek families back to their old streets. He brought Turkish families over from Anatolia. He brought Armenian merchants from the east. He brought Jewish communities who had been suffering in Christian Europe and welcomed them into his new capital with open arms. Within a few decades, Istanbul was buzzing with life again. Its markets overflowed with silks and spices, with copper pots and Persian carpets, with fish from the sea and honey from the hills. Its harbors filled with ships from Venice, from Ragusa, from Alexandria, from the Crimea. It was becoming a true world city again. Mehmed himself lived simply at first. He set up his court in the old Byzantine palaces near Hagia Sophia. But he soon began work on a great new palace complex on the tip of the peninsula, overlooking the meeting of the Bosphorus and the Sea of Marmara. He called it Topkapi, which means the Cannon Gate. It would be his home. It would be the home of his descendants for 400 years. Even today, if you walk through its courtyards and gardens, past its beautiful tiled pavilions and its quiet fountains, you can feel the shape of the world Mehmed was building. Not a fortress, not a symbol of pure power, but a garden, a retreat, a place of quiet study and gentle beauty, tucked behind high walls looking out at the sea. Mehmed loved learning. He collected books in Greek, Latin, Arabic, Persian, and Turkish. He brought Italian painters to his court, including the famous Gentle Bellini, who painted a portrait of the Sultan that still survives in London today. He invited Greek scholars to teach him philosophy. He read Homer. He read the Quran. He questioned mystics and mathematicians alike. He was, in his own quiet way, a man of the early Renaissance, standing at the crossroads of the old world and the new. And this openness of mind gave the young Ottoman capital a strange and lovely mix of cultures. Greek, Turkish, Persian, Arab, Slavic, Italian, all woven together into a single, humming tapestry. But Mehmed was not only a lover of books, he was also still a soldier, and the empire around him was still growing. Through the 1450s and 60s and 70s, he campaigned almost every year. He conquered the last independent Greek state, the despotate of the Mora, down in southern Greece. He conquered the empire of Trebizond, the last surviving Byzantine successor state, on the shores of the Black Sea. He fought long, patient wars against Venice, forcing the Italian city to acknowledge his power. He conquered great swathes of Serbia and Bosnia. He forced the Crimean Khanate, up on the northern shores of the Black Sea, to accept Ottoman overlordship. Under Mehmed, the empire grew until it wrapped almost the entire Black Sea like a warm cloak. He was called, in his own time, the sovereign of the two lands and the two seas. The two lands were Anatolia and the Balkans. The two seas were the Black and the Mediterranean. He tried, near the end of his life, one final great campaign. In the summer of 1480, an Ottoman fleet landed in southern Italy and seized the town of Otranto. All of Europe trembled. Mehmed himself, they said, planned to ride to Rome and stable his horses in St. Peter's Basilica. It seemed, for a moment, as though the Ottomans might sweep on into the heart of Christendom itself. But in the spring of 1481, as Mehmed marched east from Istanbul with a new army, he fell ill. He was only 49 years old. He died in his tent, quietly, on a hill in western Anatolia, on the 3rd of May, 1481. The exact cause of his death has been debated for centuries. Some believe he was poisoned. Some believe it was gout or a simple stomach ailment. But whatever it was, the great conqueror was gone. The Italian campaign collapsed. Otranto was abandoned, and the empire mourned. Mehmed's death set off a crisis. He had two grown sons, Bayezid and Sem. Bayezid was the older, gentler, more scholarly of the two. Sem was younger, bolder, more warlike, more like his father in temperament. Both had supporters. Both wanted the throne. When word of Mehmed's death reached Istanbul, the Janissaries acted quickly. They declared for Bayezid. Bayezid rode to the capital and was crowned. Sem, arriving too late, rebelled. There was a short and painful civil war. Sem was defeated in battle. And in one of the strangest turns of the entire Ottoman story, he fled abroad, first to the Knights of Rhodes, then to France, then to the Pope in Rome. He spent the rest of his life as a royal hostage, a bargaining chip used by European rulers to keep his brother Bayezid quiet. He died in Italy in 1495, still in gilded captivity. His body was eventually returned home to Bursa, where he was buried among his ancestors. Bayezid II, meanwhile, ruled quietly and thoughtfully for more than 30 years. He is sometimes called Bayezid the Just, sometimes Bayezid the Saint, because he was known for his deep piety, his love of Sufi mystics, and his careful, unhurried style of rule. Where his father Mehmed had been a whirlwind, always in motion, always conquering, Bayezid was more like a still, deep pool. He preferred consolidation to expansion. He built roads. He repaired bridges. He founded schools and hospitals. He calmed the border regions. He reorganized the tax system. In many ways, he did for the empire what his great-grandfather Mehmed I had done after the disaster of Timur. He healed, he steadied, he made things solid, but not everything in his reign was quiet. In 1492, a great event took place far to the west that would shape the character of Istanbul forever. The Kingdom of Spain, having just completed its long reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula, expelled its Jewish population. Tens of thousands of Sephardic Jews were suddenly without a home, forced to flee with whatever they could carry, seeking refuge across the Mediterranean. Bayezid heard the news and, according to legend, said that the Spanish King Ferdinand must be a fool to expel such a talented and industrious people, and to weaken his own kingdom in doing so was madness. Bayezid opened the ports of the Ottoman Empire to the refugees. He sent Ottoman ships to help evacuate them. Tens of thousands of Sephardic Jews settled in Istanbul, in Thessaloniki, in Izmir, in Sarajevo, and in dozens of other Ottoman cities. They brought with them the Spanish language, which they would preserve for centuries as Ladino. They brought skills in medicine, in banking, in printing, in trade. They enriched the empire enormously, and they lived in it, generally speaking, in peace and dignity for the next 400 years. Bayezid also faced serious troubles in the east. A new power had risen in Persia, a young and fiery Shah named Ismail, who was the founder of the Safavid dynasty. Ismail was a passionate Shia Muslim, and he preached his faith with the intensity of a prophet. His followers, called the Kizilbash because of the red hats they wore, spread across eastern Anatolia, converting Turkish tribes to Shia Islam, undermining Ottoman authority. Bayezid, ever cautious, hoped to solve the problem quietly, but his younger son Selim thought otherwise. Selim was ambitious, fierce, impatient. He wanted war with Persia. He wanted the throne. In the year 1512, Selim forced his aging father to abdicate. Bayezid, worn out and heartbroken, agreed to step down. He set out from Istanbul to retire in his birthplace of Dimtoka, in Thrace. He never arrived. He died on the road, only a few weeks after leaving the throne. Some historians believe he died of natural causes, worn down by grief. Others whisper that his son Selim had him poisoned. We will never know for certain. But Selim was now Sultan, and Selim would be remembered forever as Yava's Sultan Selim. Selim the Grim. Selim was one of the shortest reigning of all the great Ottoman sultans, ruling for only 8 years. But in those 8 years, he doubled the size of the empire. He crushed the Safavids at the Battle of Chaldiran in 1514, using cannons and janissaries against Persian cavalry in a brutal display of new warfare against old. He turned south and shattered the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt in a lightning campaign in 1516 and 1517. In doing so, he brought under Ottoman rule Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, Egypt, the great cities of Cairo and Damascus and Jerusalem. And most importantly of all, he brought under his protection the 2 holiest cities of Islam, Mecca and Medina. From that day forward, the Ottoman sultans would be the guardians of the holiest places in the Muslim world. Selim also took a new title, Caliph, successor to the Prophet, spiritual head of the Sunni Muslim community. The Ottoman Empire had suddenly become not just a great state, but the leading power of the Islamic world. Selim was fierce. He was ruthless. He executed viziers so often that Ottoman mothers were said to curse their disobedient children with the phrase, "May you be a vizier of Sultan Selim." But he was also, in his private life, a poet, a lover of quiet gardens, a man who wrote gentle verses in Persian. He was a bundle of contradictions, as so many of these old sultans were. And in the year 1520, only 8 years into his terrifying reign, he died suddenly on the road, of a swelling on his back, perhaps some kind of infection. He was 55 years old, and when the news reached Istanbul, the throne passed to his only surviving son, a young man of 26, a young man named Suleiman. Suleiman. In the West, he would come to be called Suleiman the Magnificent. In the East, he would be remembered as the lawgiver. And under him, the Ottoman Empire would reach the very peak of its power and its beauty. But that quiet, golden age is the story of our next chapter. For now, let the great domes of Istanbul dim in your mind. Let the noise of markets and prayers fade. Let your breathing slow, your thoughts drift, your body soften into the peaceful darkness of the night. Tonight, we return to Istanbul in the spring of 1520. In our last chapter, the fierce and brilliant Selim the Grim died on a lonely road, and word rode ahead of his body toward the capital, where a young man of 26 waited quietly to become sultan. His name was Suleiman, and under his long, gentle, extraordinary reign, the Ottoman Empire would reach the highest peak of its power and its beauty. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts settle. And let us walk together into the golden years, into the reign of the man the world would come to call the Magnificent. Suleiman was Selim's only son. There had been no long civil war to sort out succession this time, no rival brothers, no exiled princes waiting in Italian palaces. When his father died, Suleiman simply rode from his post in Manisa to Istanbul, entered the palace, and was crowned. The transition was quiet, peaceful, almost invisible. And that quiet beginning matched the character of the man himself. Suleiman was calm where his father Selim had been fierce. He was patient where his father had been impatient. He was thoughtful, well-read, deeply pious, and slow to anger. In appearance, he was tall and thin, with a long face, a hooked nose, and quiet, watchful eyes. He wrote poetry under the pen name Muhibi, which means the lover, and he wrote thousands of poems over his long life. He loved goldsmithing and would sit for hours at a small workbench, shaping quiet little pieces of jewelry with his own hands. He was, in every way, a very different man from his father. And yet, when the time came to make war, he could be as fierce as any conqueror who had ever ridden out of Anatolia. His first great campaign came almost immediately. In 1521, the young Sultan led his army north into Hungary and captured the fortress city of Belgrade, at the confluence of the Danube and Sava rivers. Belgrade had been the shield of Central Europe for over a century, turning back Ottoman assault after Ottoman assault. Suleiman's own great-grandfather, Mehmed the Conqueror, had failed to take it. Now, the young Sultan succeeded on his first try. The gates of Central Europe swung open. All the great cities of Hungary, all the plains of the Danube, lay exposed to whatever campaign he might launch next. The following year, in 1522, he turned in the other direction. He set his fleet against the island of Rhodes, held by the Knights of St. John, one of the last great crusading orders. The siege lasted 6 long months. It was terrible. Both sides fought with religious fury. But in the end, Suleiman prevailed, and the knights sailed away in ships graciously provided by the Sultan himself, sparing their lives out of respect for their courage. In just 2 campaigns, Suleiman had accomplished what his father and his great-grandfather had failed to do. Europe began to whisper his name. Back in Istanbul, Suleiman spent his years between campaigns building the empire itself. He worked with a brilliant Grand Vizier named Ibrahim Pasha, a Greek boy who had grown up in the palace, besides Suleiman, who had been his closest friend since childhood. They were, for many years, inseparable. Ibrahim helped Suleiman reorganize the government, reform the tax system, codify the laws. This is why Suleiman is called the lawgiver, or Kanuni in Turkish. He gathered up centuries of Ottoman legal tradition, Islamic religious law, and local customs, and he wove them together into a coherent, careful legal system that would govern the empire for the next 300 years. He protected religious minorities within his empire. He set clear rules about taxation, land ownership, and criminal justice. Under his laws, Christian and Jewish communities were guaranteed the right to worship freely, to run their own schools, to be judged by their own religious courts on matters of family and inheritance. It was not a perfect system by modern eyes. There were inequalities, restrictions, moments of harshness. But by the standards of the 16th century, when religious wars were tearing Europe apart, it was a remarkable example of tolerance and organized coexistence. Suleiman's court in Istanbul became one of the greatest cultural centers in the world. Poets from Persia and the Arab lands came to write in his honor. Miniaturists produced exquisite illustrated manuscripts. Musicians filled the palace with the delicate sounds of the ney flute and the oud. Astronomers built observatories. Historians recorded every event of the reign in elegant, patient prose. And rising above it all, quietly transforming the very skyline of Istanbul, was one man's genius. His name was Mimar Sinan. Sinan had been born a Christian boy in Anatolia, taken through the Devshirme system as a child, trained as a janissary engineer, and eventually risen to become chief architect of the empire. He would live to be almost 100 years old, and he would build, over the course of his career, hundreds of mosques, bridges, aqueducts, schools, hospitals, and caravanserais all across the Ottoman world. But his greatest works are the great mosques of Istanbul and Edirne. The Süleymaniye Mosque, which he built for his sultan in the 1550s, still stands on one of the 7 hills of Istanbul, its 4 minarets rising like slender candles above the city. Its enormous dome, half filled with light, seems almost weightless. Inside, the acoustics are so perfect that a whispered prayer at one end of the Great Hall can be heard clearly at the other. Sinan would go on to build an even greater work, the Selimiye Mosque in Edirne, later in his life. But the Süleymaniye is the heart of his partnership with Suleiman, sultan and architect, working side by side to shape a city and an age. The empire under Suleiman was enormous. It stretched from the walls of Vienna in the west to the borders of Persia in the east, from the deserts of Yemen in the south to the plains of Ukraine in the north. It included great cities like Cairo, Damascus, Baghdad, Belgrade, Sarajevo, Algiers, and Basra. Its fleet, under the brilliant Admiral Barbarossa, controlled much of the Mediterranean. Its armies were the largest and best trained in the world. Its treasury was full. Its markets hummed with trade from India, Africa, Europe, and the Ottoman heartlands. Ambassadors from every court in Europe waited for weeks in Istanbul, hopping for an audience with the Sultan. When they were finally admitted, they walked through gates and courtyards in reverent silence, awed by the discipline of the Janissaries standing at attention, by the beauty of the tiled walls, by the quiet dignity of it all. But Suleiman's life, for all its magnificence, was not without deep sorrows, and here we must speak of the woman who stood at his side. Her name was Hürrem, sometimes called Roxolana in the West. She had been born in what is now Ukraine, taken as a slave in a Tartar raid when she was still a young girl, brought to the imperial harem in Istanbul. She caught the young sultan's eye, and then something extraordinary happened. Suleiman fell in love with her, truly, deeply in love. He wrote her hundreds of poems. He raised her from slave to concubine to legal wife, breaking with centuries of Ottoman tradition. Sultans had not married their concubines for generations. He did it anyway because he could not imagine life without her. He gave her more political power than any Ottoman woman had ever held. She wrote letters to foreign kings. She founded charitable institutions. She built mosques and hospitals. She was, in every meaningful sense, his partner in ruling the empire. But the love that gave Suleiman such joy also created painful complications. His oldest son, Mustafa, by another mother, was popular and capable, adored by the Janissaries, seen by many as the natural heir. Hürrem had sons of her own, and she wanted the throne to go to one of them. Whispers reached the Sultan's ear that Mustafa was plotting against him. In 1553, on campaign in eastern Anatolia, Suleiman summoned his son to his tent. Mustafa entered alone. The mute executioners were waiting. They strangled him with a silken bowstring in the traditional Ottoman way. Suleiman watched, they say, from behind a curtain. He is said to have wept for days afterward, but it was done. And later, another son, Bayezid, would rebel against his father and would be defeated, would flee to Persia, and would eventually be executed along with his 4 young children. These are the darkest shadows on Suleiman's golden reign. He loved his family. He killed members of it, over and over, because that was the price of holding the throne. The old law of the empire allowed a new sultan to kill his brothers to prevent civil war. Suleiman himself did not have to face brothers when he came to power, but he brought that terrible law down upon his own children when politics demanded it. Hürrem died in 1558. Suleiman never truly recovered. He grew older, sadder, quieter. His court became more somber. He continued to campaign, though he was now an old man, riding in a covered litter alongside his soldiers rather than on horseback. In the summer of 1566, he set out on one final campaign against the fortress of Szatmár in Hungary. He was 71 years old and in failing health. He should not have gone, but he could not bear to stop. Duty was in his blood. He arrived at Szatmár in early August. The siege was long and difficult. The fortress was defended by a brave Croatian nobleman named Nikola Zedrinski. Suleiman's health declined day by day. And on the 7th of September, 1566, in his tent in the middle of the Ottoman camp, the great Sultan quietly died. His Grand Vizier, Sokollu Mehmed Pasha, did something remarkable. He kept the death secret. For 48 days, he pretended that the Sultan was still alive, ill perhaps, but still ruling. He forged Suleiman's signature on documents. He kept the army marching. He waited until the Sultan's son Selim could be safely brought to Istanbul and crowned. Only then, when the succession was secure, did he announce the death of the greatest sultan the empire had ever known. Suleiman was buried in a beautiful little tomb behind his Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul, beside the tomb of his beloved Hürrem. If you visit today, you will see them still, side by side, husband and wife, sultan and lover, resting quietly under the domes of the city they made together. Suleiman's death marked the end of the Golden Age. The empire he left behind was still enormous, still powerful, still magnificent, but something had shifted. His son, Selim II, was a very different kind of ruler, and in our next chapter, we will begin to trace the long, slow, quiet turning of the Ottoman story from the peak of its power toward the years of drift and struggle that lay ahead. For now, let the great domes of Suleiman's Istanbul dim gently in your mind. Let the sound of prayers fade into evening. Let your breathing slow, your thoughts drift, your body settle into peaceful sleep. Tonight, we return to Istanbul in the autumn of 1566. In our last chapter, the great Suleiman died quietly in his tent outside Shajdvara, and his loyal Grand Vizier kept the news secret for 48 days so that the succession could be secured. When the death was finally announced, all of Istanbul went into mourning. Suleiman had ruled for 46 years. He had shaped every corner of the empire. He had built its greatest mosques, written its greatest laws, waged its most famous wars. To many of his subjects, it must have felt as though the sun itself had gone out. Let your breathing slow, let your body soften, and let us walk together into the long twilight that followed his passing. His son, Selim II, was crowned in Istanbul on the 29th of September, 1566. Selim was 42 years old when he took the throne, which was, by Ottoman standards, rather old for a new sultan. He was a very different man from his father. Where Suleiman had been tall and thin, Selim was short and round. Where Suleiman had been abstemious and pious, Selim was fond of wine. History remembers him, sometimes cruelly, as Selim the Sot or Selim the Drunkard. That is probably an unfair name for a complex man, but it does capture something real about his reign. Selim had little interest in the daily business of ruling. He was happy to leave that work to his Grand Vizier, Sokollu Mehmed Pasha, the same brilliant statesman who had covered up his father's death. Sokollu was one of the greatest administrators the empire ever produced, and for the next 14 years, from behind the throne of Selim and his son after him, Sokollu essentially ran the empire. Under Sokollu's steady hand, the empire continued to seem strong. It even expanded. Cyprus was conquered from the Venetians in 1570 and 1571, adding a beautiful and strategically important island to the Ottoman realm. Yemen was reconquered. Ottoman armies pushed into the Caucasus. Ottoman fleets sailed across the Mediterranean, seemingly unstoppable. But then, on the 7th of October, 1571, something happened that shook the world. A great fleet from the Holy League, a coalition of Venice, Spain, the Papal States, and various Italian cities, met the Ottoman fleet in the Gulf of Corinth, near a small port called Lepanto. Both fleets were enormous, hundreds of galleys on each side, tens of thousands of sailors and soldiers. The Ottoman admiral was Ali Pasha, a brave and experienced commander. The Christian fleet was led by Don Juan of Austria, half-brother of the King of Spain. The battle that followed was one of the largest naval engagements in all of history. It lasted only a few hours, but when the smoke cleared, the Ottoman fleet had been almost completely destroyed. Perhaps 200 galleys sunk or captured, perhaps 30,000 sailors killed. Ali Pasha himself was dead, his head displayed on a spike. All across Europe, church bells rang out in celebration. It seemed, for one giddy moment, that the Ottoman tide had finally been turned back. But the truth was more complicated. Sokollu Mehmed Pasha, on receiving the news, is said to have remarked calmly that the Christians had merely singed the Sultan's beard, while the Ottomans had cut off Venice's arm when they took Cyprus. He was right. Within a single year, the Ottomans had rebuilt their fleet from scratch. 250 new galleys were floating in the shipyards of Istanbul by the spring of 1572. The lost ships had been replaced. The lost men had not, and that was the deeper truth of Lepanto. The Ottomans had lost an entire generation of skilled sailors, navigators, and marines, and these could not be rebuilt as quickly as wooden hulls. From that day forward, the balance of naval power in the Mediterranean would slowly, quietly, tilt away from Istanbul. Selim II did not live long after Lepanto. He died in 1574, some say from a slip on the wet marble of his palace bathhouse. His son, Murad III, took the throne. Murad was a thoughtful man, deeply interested in astrology, mysticism, and the arts. He commissioned beautiful manuscripts. He listened to poets. He collected precious jewels. But he shared his father's disinterest in the daily grind of government, and unlike his father, he did not always trust his ministers. He preferred to rule from within the palace, sending down orders through eunuchs and favorites, rarely appearing in public. Slowly, quietly, this began to change the character of Ottoman government. The old sultans had ridden with their armies. They had presided over council meetings. They had listened to petitions from ordinary subjects. Now, more and more, the sultan became a hidden figure, secluded behind palace walls, glimpsed only rarely by his own people. And this seclusion, this slow drawing back from the world, would prove to be one of the quiet fault lines running through the coming centuries. Sokollu Mehmed Pasha, the great Grand Vizier, was assassinated in 1579 by a deranged petitioner. With his death, an era ended. The steady hand that had guided the empire since Suleiman's last years was gone, and no one quite as capable would replace him for a very long time. Grand Viziers now came and went with alarming speed. Some served only a few months before being executed or exiled. Court factions rose and fell. The women of the imperial harem, especially the Sultan's mother, called the Valide Sultan, began to play a much larger role in politics. This period is sometimes called the Sultanate of Women, though that name is misleading. It was not really that women ruled the empire. It was that, in an age of weak or absent sultans, the closest advisors of the throne, whoever they happened to be, mattered more than ever before. And often, those closest advisors were the Sultan's mother, or his favorite consort, or his chief black eunuch. Murad III died in 1595. His son, Mehmed III, did something terrible on his accession. Following an old and brutal Ottoman law, he ordered the execution of all 19 of his younger brothers. All of them were strangled with silken bowstrings, one by one, on the same day. The little boys, some of them still children, were carried out to be buried beside their father. It was said that the sound of their mother's weeping could be heard for days throughout the palace. This grim tradition had once been justified as a way to prevent civil war. But by now, it seemed only to horrify the Sultan's subjects. Even the Janissaries were shaken. And after this last great massacre of princes, the tradition would begin, slowly, to fade. In its place would come a new system, one that would create its own problems in the centuries ahead. Instead of killing rival princes, later sultans would confine them to sealed quarters within the palace, called the kafes or the cage. There they would grow up in isolation, without education, without political experience, without contact with the outside world. When their time came to rule, if it ever came, they often emerged as frightened, damaged men. But that is a story for another chapter. Mehmed III himself did not rule for long. He died in 1603, and his son Ahmed I inherited the throne at only 13 years old. Ahmed was a gentle boy, thoughtful, devout, artistically inclined. His mother and the palace faction that supported him ruled through him for many years, but Ahmed left behind one great gift to the city of Istanbul. He built the Sultan Ahmed Mosque, which the world now knows as the Blue Mosque, for the beautiful blue tiles that line its interior walls. It rises across from Hagia Sophia, its 6 minarets pointing up like slender fingers toward the sky. If you stand in the great square between them at dusk, when the muezzins call prayer, and the 2 enormous domes glow softly in the fading light, you can still feel something of what the empire was and what it was becoming. Around the turn of the 17th century, deeper problems began to appear in the empire. The great inflation of silver from the Americas, flowing into Europe from Spanish mines in the New World, sent prices soaring across the Mediterranean. Ottoman soldiers and officials, paid in fixed amounts of increasingly worthless coin, grew angry. Peasants in Anatolia, squeezed by rising taxes and falling wages, began to rebel. These uprisings, called the Selali rebellions, tore through the Anatolian countryside for decades. Whole regions were depopulated. Villages were abandoned. Bandit armies roamed the hills. It took the empire generations to fully calm this crisis. And in the meantime, the Janissaries, once the empire's most loyal and disciplined force, began to change. They started to marry, to open shops, to take up trades in the cities where they were stationed. They began to think of themselves less as soldiers of the Sultan and more as a privileged corps with rights and interests of their own. And when a sultan or a grand vizier tried to reform them, they had a simple, terrible remedy. They rioted. They marched on the palace. And sometimes they overthrew the sultan. This is exactly what happened in 1622 to Ahmed's son Osman II. Young Osman had come to the throne at only 14 years old, and he was a serious, thoughtful boy who dreamed of reforming his empire. He wanted to disband the Janissaries and build a new army recruited from Anatolian and Egyptian troops. When the Janissaries got wind of his plans, they mutinied. They stormed the palace. They dragged young Osman out. And in one of the darkest days in Ottoman history, they murdered their own sultan, a boy still only 17 years old. It was the first time in Ottoman history that a sultan had been killed by his own troops. It would not be the last. The empire recovered from this shock, as it had recovered from so many others. Osman's uncle, Mustafa I, took the throne briefly, though he was mentally unstable and could not rule. Then Osman's younger brother, Murad IV, was crowned in 1623 at only 11 years old. Murad grew into one of the fiercest sultans the empire ever produced. He was tall, immensely strong, and utterly ruthless. When he came of age, he broke the power of the rebellious Janissaries with terrifying force. He rode the streets of Istanbul at night, sometimes in disguise, executing anyone he caught drinking coffee, smoking tobacco, or breaking his strict new laws. Coffee houses, he believed, were nests of gossip and rebellion. He had thousands of them closed and many of their patrons executed. He was harsh, but he was effective. Under his rule, order returned to the empire, at least for a time. He personally led his armies to reconquer Baghdad from the Persians in 1638 in one of the last truly great Ottoman military triumphs. But Murad, hard as iron, was also hard on himself. He drank heavily. He died young, only 27, in 1640. And after him, the throne passed to his mentally fragile brother Ibrahim, who had been raised in the cage. What followed was chaos. And that chaos is where our next chapter will begin. For now, let the palace gates close gently. Let the whispers of eunuchs and viziers fade into the quiet. Let your breathing slow, your body soften, your thoughts drift into peaceful sleep. Tonight, we return to Istanbul in the year 1640. In our last chapter, the fierce young Sultan Murad IV died at only 27 years old, having reconquered Baghdad and terrified his empire back into order. When he died, the throne passed to the last surviving son of his father, Ahmed I, a man who had spent his entire life locked away in a small, sealed chamber deep inside the palace. A man named Ibrahim. Let your breathing slow. Let your shoulders soften. And let us step gently into the strange and troubled years that followed. Ibrahim had been raised in the Kafes, the gilded cage. From the age of 2, he had lived in a small suite of rooms, guarded by mute servants and deaf gardeners. He had never gone to school. He had never ridden a horse in open country. He had never spoken with a foreign ambassador or reviewed a company of soldiers. He had grown up believing, quite reasonably, that at any moment his older brother Murad might send the executioners to strangle him with a silken bowstring. When word came that Murad was dead and that he, Ibrahim, was now sultan, he did not believe it. He thought it was a trick. He refused to leave his little room. His mother had to bring in Murad's body itself and lay it before him before he would accept that he was truly free. Even then, he trembled and wept. Ibrahim's short reign is one of the strangest in all of Ottoman history. He tried, in his own broken way, to be a good sultan. But he had no preparation for the role. His nerves were shattered from years of imprisonment. He suffered from what we would today call severe anxiety, perhaps deeper mental illness. He became obsessed with luxury, decorating his chambers with sable furs and covering himself in perfumes. He was easily manipulated by the courtiers around him, who often exploited his weaknesses for their own gain. There are stories, some perhaps exaggerated, of Ibrahim throwing gold coins to the fish in the palace ponds, or filling entire rooms with women from the harem. What is certain is that under his reign, real power slipped almost entirely into the hands of the palace faction, especially his mother, the formidable Kursum Sultan. Kursum Sultan is one of the most extraordinary women in all of Ottoman history. She had come to the palace as a young slave girl. She had risen to become the favorite of Ahmed I. She had survived the reigns of two of her sons and now guided a third. She was intelligent, patient, and politically brilliant. During Ibrahim's troubled reign, and later during the early years of her grandson Mehmed IV, Kursum was the true ruler of the empire. She held councils. She appointed viziers. She oversaw the treasury. She organized charitable works across the city. And she managed, for many years, to keep the state functioning despite the storms that raged around her. But even Kursum could not save Ibrahim. In 1648, the Janissaries and the religious scholars finally decided that the Sultan was too unstable to rule. They marched on the palace. They deposed him. His own mother, some say, agreed reluctantly to the decision, seeing no other way. Ibrahim was returned to a small cell, similar to the one where he had spent his childhood. 10 days later, he was strangled. He was 33 years old. His 7-year-old son was pulled from the harem, dressed in oversized robes, and placed upon the Ottoman throne. That little boy was Mehmed IV. Because Mehmed was a child, the empire was ruled for many years by his grandmother Kursum, and competing with her by his mother Turhan Sultan. The two women hated each other. In 1651, in one of the darkest palace intrigues of the century, Kursum was murdered by servants loyal to Turhan. The old sultana was strangled in her own chambers. All of Istanbul mourned her, for she had been beloved by the common people for her charity and her steady hand. Turhan Sultan now became regent for her young son, and though she was less experienced than Kursum had been, she made one truly great decision. She turned her family of tough, capable statesmen from a village in Albania called Kurprulu, and with that decision, she saved the empire. In 1656, when things had become truly desperate, Turhan appointed an old, gruff, 70-year-old man named Kurprulu Mehmed Pasha as Grand Vizier. Kurprulu accepted the post only on the condition that the young sultan and his mother would never interfere with his decisions. They agreed, and Kurprulu immediately went to work. He was harsh. He was ruthless. He executed corrupt officials by the dozens. He restored discipline to the Janissaries. He crushed rebellions in Anatolia and the Balkans. He restored the finances of the state. In just a few years, he had brought the empire back from the edge of collapse. When he died in 1661, he was succeeded by his own son, Kurprulu Fazil Ahmed Pasha, who continued the work with equal skill. And for the next 30 years, various members of the Kurprulu family would serve as Grand Viziers, getting the empire through some of its most difficult times. This period is sometimes called the Kurprulu era. It was the last great flowering of Ottoman power in Europe. Under the Kurprulus, the empire launched one final great campaign into the heart of Europe. In 1683, a huge Ottoman army marched north under the command of Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha. Their goal was the imperial capital of the Habsburgs, the city of Vienna. It was one of the largest armies the Ottomans had ever fielded, perhaps 150,000 men, great cannons, endless supply trains. All of Europe held its breath. If Vienna fell, the road to the heart of the continent lay open. The siege began in mid-July and lasted for 2 long months. The defenders, led by a brave commander named Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg, held on with tremendous courage, though supplies dwindled and disease spread. It seemed only a matter of time before the walls broke, but help was coming. All across Europe, kings and princes had responded to the pleas of the Pope and the Habsburg Emperor. A great relief army was gathering. Its overall commander was the King of Poland, a fierce and brilliant warrior named Jan Sobieski. On the 11th of September, 1683, Sobieski's forces arrived at the top of the Kahlenberg Hills, overlooking the Ottoman camp. They numbered around 80,000 men, including the famous Polish winged hussars, with their strange feathered wings rising from their backs like great white pillars. On the morning of the 12th of September, the relief army swept down from the hills in one of the largest cavalry charges in the entire history of Europe. The Ottoman army was caught between the walls of Vienna and this thundering wave of horse. It broke and fled. Kara Mustafa Pasha rode away with the survivors. Vast quantities of supplies, tents, cannons, and even the Sultan's holy standard were captured. It was a catastrophe. The consequences of Vienna reached far beyond that single defeat. All the enemies of the Ottomans smelled weakness. The Habsburgs, the Poles, the Venetians, and the Russians formed a holy league and began to press the empire from every direction. Kara Mustafa Pasha was executed on the Sultan's order shortly after his return, strangled in Belgrade. But no execution could turn back the tide. For 16 years, the empire fought a defensive war on multiple fronts. It lost battle after battle. Hungary, which had been under Ottoman rule for over a century, was slowly torn away. Great fortress of Buda fell to the Habsburgs in 1686, after 145 years of Ottoman rule. Belgrade fell too, briefly, though it was later recovered. In 1699, the exhausted empire finally signed the Treaty of Karlowitz. It was the first great peace treaty in Ottoman history in which the empire had to give up major territory. Hungary, Transylvania, and parts of the Peloponnese were lost. The long era of Ottoman expansion in Europe was over. From now on, the empire would be more and more on the defensive. For thoughtful Ottoman statesmen, the shock of Karlowitz was immense. For centuries, they had believed that their empire was invincible, blessed by God, destined always to expand. Now, for the first time, they had to confront the fact that Europe was catching up, in some ways surpassing them, in military technology, in state organization, in wealth. Some began to whisper that reforms were needed, that the empire had to learn from its enemies, that the old ways were not enough. But others resisted fiercely, seeing any change as a betrayal of tradition. And this argument, quiet at first, would grow louder and louder over the coming centuries until it would come to define the very fate of the empire. The early 1700s brought a brief and beautiful pause. Sultan Ahmed III took the throne in 1703. His Grand Vizier, Ibrahim Pasha, was a cultured and intelligent man who genuinely wanted to open the empire to the world. Together, they ushered in what is called the Tulip Era, one of the most graceful and creative periods in all of Ottoman history. It gets its name from the tulip, a flower that the Ottoman elite fell in love with during these years, cultivating hundreds of varieties in the gardens of their villas along the Bosphorus. It was an age of festivals, of poetry, of miniature painting, of fireworks shows on the water. The first Ottoman printing press was established during these years. In 1727, printing books in Turkish and Arabic for the first time in the empire's history. Envoys were sent to Paris and Vienna to observe European life and bring back reports. Small changes began to seep in: new military drill techniques, new engineering methods, new tastes in music and architecture. But the Tulip Era ended abruptly and painfully. In 1730, a Janissary revolt led by a man named Patrona Halil brought down the whole government. Ibrahim Pasha was murdered. Sultan Ahmed III was deposed. The beautiful garden villas were burned. The printing press was shut down for a time. The reformers were sent into exile. The empire drew back into itself again, wary of change, uncertain of its future. The rest of the 18th century was a slow, painful drift. Wars with Russia and Austria came and went, most of them ending badly for the Ottomans. Russia grew stronger every year, pushing south toward the Black Sea, eventually reaching its shores by 1774 with the disastrous Treaty of Kusuk-Kainaka. Under that treaty, the Ottomans lost the entire northern coast of the Black Sea, including Crimea. Russia was granted the right to represent Orthodox Christians within the Ottoman Empire, which she would use as a pretext for future interventions again and again. It was a humiliating agreement, and every Ottoman statesman who read it knew that something was deeply wrong. The empire was no longer feared. The empire was no longer respected. The empire was, quietly, becoming what European diplomats would soon call the sick man of Europe. But not everyone was willing to accept this decline. In the coming decades, new sultans would arise who dreamed of reform, of renewal, of building a modern state that could stand once more upon its own 2 feet. In our next chapter, we will follow those quiet reformers as they tried, with courage and heartbreak, to save their ancient empire. For now, let the tulips of Istanbul dim in your mind. Let the fireworks fade over the Bosphorus. Let your breathing slow, your thoughts settle, your body drift softly into peaceful sleep. Tonight, we return to the shores of the Bosphorus in the late 1700s. In our last chapter, we watch the empire lose the Crimea to Russia, sign a humiliating treaty, and quietly begin to earn a painful new name whispered in the courts of Europe: the sick man. But even in the deepest illness, some minds still burn brightly. And there were sultans and statesmen in these years who refused to accept decline as fate. Let your breathing slow, let your body soften, and let us walk together into the long, brave, heartbreaking century of Ottoman reform. The first of these reforming sultans was Selim III. He came to the throne in 1789, in the very same year that revolution broke out in Paris. He was 28 years old, thoughtful, artistic, deeply pious, and burning with the desire to restore his empire's dignity. Selim wrote music. He played the ney flute, that long, breathy Sufi instrument. He composed dozens of pieces that are still played today in Turkey. He also read widely, corresponded with European ambassadors, and studied the reforms that were transforming other kingdoms. And he believed, quietly but firmly, that the empire had to modernize its army if it was going to survive. Selim called his new project the Nizam Letter 131 Ceded, which means the New Order. He created a small, disciplined new army trained along European lines, drilled by French officers, equipped with modern muskets and artillery. It was only a few thousand men at first, meant to grow slowly, meant to eventually replace the old Janissary Corps that had become so unreliable. Selim also opened new schools, including a naval engineering school and a military engineering school. He sent Ottoman ambassadors to Paris, London, Vienna, and Berlin for the first time, to be permanent embassies rather than temporary missions. He reorganized the treasury. He tried to bring order to the provinces. It was a careful, patient, methodical program of reform, and it terrified the old power centers of the empire. The Janissaries hated the new order. They saw, correctly, that it was designed to make them obsolete. The conservative religious scholars hated it too. They believed that copying European ways was a betrayal of Islamic tradition. And provincial governors, many of whom had grown into local warlords, feared that any strengthening of central authority would cost them their privileges. Slowly, quietly, resentment gathered around Selim like a coming storm. In 1807, the storm broke. A revolt erupted among the auxiliary troops in the capital. The Janissaries joined it. They marched on the palace. They demanded that the new order be dissolved. Selim, gentle even in this moment, agreed. He disbanded his new army. He hoped, perhaps foolishly, that peace could still be preserved. But it was too late. The rebels deposed him and placed his cousin Mustafa IV on the throne. For a few months, the reformers regrouped. A brave provincial governor named Alemdar Mustafa Pasha marched on Istanbul in 1808, hoping to restore Selim to the throne. But when he arrived, he was too late. Selim had already been murdered inside the palace, strangled on Mustafa's orders. Alemdar wept when he saw the body, but he still had a card to play. There was one more prince alive, hidden in the harem, a young man of 23 named Mahmud. Alemdar's men rushed through the palace, found the young prince, and pulled him from his hiding place. Mahmud was crowned that same day, and a new chapter of the reform story began. Mahmud II is one of the great figures of Ottoman history. He was quiet, patient, calculating, and quite different from his gentle cousin Selim. He had learned a hard lesson from Selim's death. You could not reform the empire while the Janissaries still existed. They would always rise up. It would always destroy you. So Mahmud pretended for many years to be a modest and traditional ruler. He hid his true intentions. He built up loyal troops slowly and quietly. He appointed reformers to key positions but let them work in the shadows. He waited some more, almost 18 full years of waiting. Finally, in June of 1826, he was ready. Mahmud announced the creation of a new modern army. The Janissaries, as everyone knew they would, revolted. They gathered in their traditional square, overturned their great copper cooking pots, and prepared to march on the palace as they had done so many times before. But this time, Mahmud was ready. He had loyal artillery units positioned on the surrounding hills. He had the support of the religious scholars, whom he had carefully won over. He had the backing of the common people of Istanbul, who had grown weary of Janissary violence and corruption. When the Janissaries assembled, Mahmud's cannons opened fire. The old barracks were destroyed. Thousands of Janissaries were killed. The survivors were hunted down in the streets. The corps was formally abolished. This event, terrible and necessary, is remembered in Ottoman history as the auspicious incident, the Vakari Herii. In a single day, the 400-year-old institution that had once been the pride of the empire was gone. Mahmud could finally begin his real work. Over the next 13 years, Mahmud reformed almost every aspect of Ottoman life. He built a modern army from scratch, trained by Prussian officers, equipped with modern weapons. He reorganized the government into modern ministries, with proper offices, salaries, and record-keeping. He introduced modern uniforms, replacing the great turbans of centuries past with a red felt cap called the fez, which would become the symbol of the modern Ottoman gentleman. He founded the first Ottoman newspaper. He sent students abroad to study in Europe. He reformed education. He built new roads. He instituted a census. He even had his portrait painted in a modern style and hung in government offices, breaking with centuries of tradition that had kept the Sultan's face hidden from his own subjects. But even Mahmud could not stop the empire's territorial losses. During his reign, Greece won its independence after a long, brutal war that lasted from 1821 to 1829. Serbia gained autonomy. Algeria was seized by France in 1830. And most painful of all, Mahmud's own governor of Egypt, a brilliant and ambitious man named Mohammed Ali Pasha, rebelled against Istanbul and nearly toppled the empire from within. Mohammed Ali's Egyptian army, French-trained and modern in every way, actually defeated the Sultan's own forces in 1832 and again in 1839. Only the intervention of the European great powers, who did not want to see either the Ottoman Empire collapse or Mohammed Ali grow too strong, prevented total disaster. It was a bitter humiliation, and Mahmud died in 1839 at only 54 years old, worn down by the strain of it all. His son, Abdülmecid I, was only 16 when he took the throne. But this gentle young man immediately continued his father's reforms with even greater ambition. In November of 1839, only a few months after his coronation, his brilliant foreign minister Mustafa Rashid Pasha stood in the palace gardens of Gulhane and read out a great imperial decree. This decree, known as the Tanzimat, or the reorganization, promised sweeping changes. All subjects of the empire, whether Muslim, Christian, or Jewish, would be equal before the law. The lives, honor, and property of every citizen would be protected. Taxation would be reformed. Justice would be codified. Military service would be regularized. It was, in its way, an Ottoman echo of the great constitutional documents that had swept through Europe in the previous decades. The Tanzimat era, which lasted roughly from 1839 to 1876, was a period of enormous change. New schools were built across the empire, including the first Ottoman university and the first Ottoman medical school. Steamships began to carry passengers and goods along the coasts. Railways began to appear, cutting travel times dramatically. Telegraph lines connected Istanbul to Vienna and Paris. New law codes were drafted, drawing on both Islamic tradition and French legal models. Non-Muslims began to serve in government offices, in the army, in the diplomatic corps. The empire began, quietly and painfully, to reshape itself into something modern. But the Tanzimat was not without its critics. Conservative Muslims felt that too much was being borrowed from Europe, that traditional Islamic values were being pushed aside. Many Christians and Jews welcomed the reforms, but complained they were not implemented consistently in the provinces. European powers, meanwhile, pressed constantly for more reforms, while also nibbling away at Ottoman territory whenever they could. The empire was pulled in every direction. It was a difficult, contradictory, exhausting time. And then came the Crimean War, from 1853 to 1856. Russia, ever pressing southward, attacked the Ottomans over disputed rights of Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land. To almost everyone's surprise, Britain and France came to the aid of the Sultan. Together, the Allied armies fought Russia to a standstill in the Crimean Peninsula. It was the war of Florence Nightingale, of Tolstoy at Sevastopol, of the charge of the Light Brigade. And when the peace treaty was signed in Paris in 1856, the Ottoman Empire was formally admitted into the concert of Europe, treated for the first time as a European power among equals. It was a rare moment of dignity, but it did not last. The costs of the war and of the Tanzimat reforms began to crush the imperial treasury. The Ottoman government borrowed enormous sums from European banks at high interest rates, and by 1875, it could no longer pay. The empire declared bankruptcy. It was a devastating blow to Ottoman pride, and it gave European powers new leverage over Ottoman affairs. A great commission was set up to manage Ottoman debts, staffed by European officials, quietly running important parts of the imperial economy on behalf of foreign creditors. The empire's finances were, in effect, no longer entirely its own. In 1876, a great crisis erupted. Uprisings broke out in Bulgaria, Bosnia, and Herzegovina, and the Ottoman response was brutal. Thousands of Bulgarian villages were massacred by irregular troops, and the news reached Europe with tremendous force. The British statesman Gladstone wrote a famous pamphlet condemning the Bulgarian horrors. All the great powers turned against the empire. Sultan Abdulaziz was deposed by his own ministers, replaced by his nephew Murad V. But Murad had a nervous breakdown almost immediately and had to be replaced in his turn, only 3 months into his reign, by his younger brother Abdul Hamid II. Abdul Hamid was 34 years old when he came to the throne. He was quiet, watchful, deeply suspicious, immensely intelligent. He was also, unlike almost any Ottoman ruler before him, absolutely determined to keep his empire together no matter what it cost. Under him, the Ottoman story would enter its final, most complicated chapter. A chapter of railways and secret police, of young Turks and world wars, of empire and revolution. But that story is our next and final quiet chapter. For now, let the reforms of Mahmud fade gently. Let the gardens of Gulhane grow silent. Let your breathing slow, your body soften, your thoughts drift into peaceful, dreamless sleep. We come to the final chapter of our long, quiet journey through 600 years of Ottoman history. In our last chapter, a young sultan named Abdul Hamid II took the throne in 1876 at a moment of terrible crisis. Uprisings raged in the Balkans. European powers were pressing from every side. The treasury was empty. The reforms of his father and grandfather had brought progress, but also enormous strain. And into this troubled inheritance stepped one of the most complicated men in all of Ottoman history. Let your breathing slow, let your body soften, and let us walk together, one last time, into the empire's final decades. Abdul Hamid II began his reign with a bold promise. He accepted a new constitution, the first in Ottoman history, drafted by the great reformer Midhat Pasha. This constitution created an elected parliament, guaranteed civil liberties, and seemed to move the empire firmly into the modern age. The first Ottoman parliament actually met in Istanbul in March of 1877, with representatives from all across the empire, Muslim and Christian and Jewish, sitting together to debate the affairs of state. It was a remarkable moment, but it did not last. Within a year, Russia had invaded once more, sweeping through the Balkans and coming within sight of Istanbul itself. The war ended in disaster. Bulgaria became largely independent. Serbia, Romania, and Montenegro won full independence. Vast Ottoman territories were lost, and Abdul Hamid, using the crisis as his excuse, suspended the constitution and dissolved the parliament in February of 1878. Parliament would not meet again for 30 years. What followed was one of the longest and most controversial reigns in Ottoman history. Abdul Hamid ruled almost as an absolute monarch from behind the high walls of Yildiz Palace. He was intensely private, deeply suspicious, protected by a network of secret police and informers. He almost never left his palace grounds, fearing assassination. And yet, within those walls, he was also remarkably active. He built railways. The Great Hijaz Railway, running from Damascus to Medina, was built during his reign as a gift to Muslim pilgrims. He built modern schools in every province. He expanded the telegraph network across the empire, allowing him to receive news from the furthest corners of his realm within hours. He established modern universities. He built hospitals. He commissioned photographs of every corner of his empire, thousands of them, so that he could see with his own eyes what his lands looked like, what his subjects wore, what his cities were becoming. Some of those photographs still survive today in Istanbul, in vast albums that reveal a lost world in astonishing detail. But Abdul Hamid also used a heavy hand. His censors watched over every book, every newspaper, every play. Words considered dangerous were banned. Exiles fled to Paris and Geneva, where they plotted against him from afar. Massacres of Armenians occurred in the 1890s, some of the darkest events of his reign, prompting international outrage. He resisted every European demand for reform in his eastern provinces, seeing them as pretexts for further intervention. He balanced the great powers against one another with genuine diplomatic skill, playing Britain against Russia against Germany. He kept his empire together, more or less, for 33 years. But the price he paid for that survival was heavy indeed. Meanwhile, a new generation was rising. In the military academies and medical schools that Abdul Hamid himself had built, young officers and intellectuals were reading forbidden books, whispering forbidden ideas. They called themselves the Young Turks. They dreamed of restoring the constitution, of ending the Sultan's absolute rule, of building a modern Ottoman nation in which all peoples could be citizens together. Their most important organization, the Committee of Union and Progress, spread quietly through the officer corps of the Third Army, based in Macedonia. In the summer of 1908, they revolted. Whole army units marched out of their barracks and declared their support for the constitution. Abdul Hamid, seeing that he could not stop them, gave in. He restored the constitution of 1876. Parliament met again in Istanbul to great celebration. For a brief, glowing moment, it seemed that the empire had finally found its way forward, but the joy did not last. The very next year, in April of 1909, a counter-revolution broke out in Istanbul, and Abdul Hamid was suspected of secretly encouraging it. The Young Turks responded by deposing him. He was sent into exile in Thessaloniki. His half-brother Mehmed V took the throne, an old man of 65 who had spent most of his life in the harem and had little experience of government. Real power now rested with the Committee of Union and Progress, especially with three ambitious officers who would come to dominate the government. Their names were Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Semel Pasha. History would remember them as the Three Pashas. The final decade of the empire was one long procession of disaster. In 1911, Italy attacked Ottoman Libya and seized it. In 1912, the small states of the Balkans, Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro, formed an alliance and attacked together. The Ottoman armies collapsed. In just a few weeks, almost all remaining Ottoman territory in Europe was lost. Even Edirne, the second capital, fell briefly to the Bulgarians. Only a small strip of land in Thrace remained. Millions of Muslim refugees streamed toward Istanbul, fleeing homes their families had lived in for centuries. The empire, once master of the Balkans, was now nearly expelled from them entirely. And then, in the summer of 1914, came the First World War. The Ottoman leadership hesitated at first, unsure whether to join the fight, and if so, on which side. But Enver Pasha admired the Germans and had built close ties with them. In late October of 1914, Ottoman warships, technically German ships with Ottoman flags, attacked Russian ports in the Black Sea. The empire was now at war with Russia, Britain, and France. It was a decision that would determine everything that followed. The war was a nightmare for the Ottoman Empire. On the Eastern Front, an Ottoman army marched into the freezing mountains of the Caucasus in the winter of 1914 and 1915 and was almost entirely destroyed. Perhaps 90,000 men died of cold, hunger, and Russian bullets. In the spring of 1915, British and Australian and New Zealand forces landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula, hoping to seize Istanbul itself. For 9 long, terrible months, they fought against Ottoman defenders. On the Ottoman side, a young colonel named Mustafa Kemal rose to prominence, commanding troops with remarkable skill and personal courage. In the end, the invaders withdrew, defeated. Gallipoli was the empire's last great military victory, but it came at a terrible cost. Hundreds of thousands died on both sides, and it was, in the larger picture, only a delay. In the same period, one of the darkest events of the war unfolded in eastern Anatolia. Beginning in the spring of 1915, the Ottoman government carried out the mass deportation and killing of the Armenian population of the empire. Hundreds of thousands of Armenian men, women, and children were killed or died on forced marches into the Syrian desert. Historians estimate that between 1 and 1.5 million Armenians perished. This is remembered by Armenians and much of the world today as the Armenian Genocide, though the Turkish government has long contested that term. It stands as one of the most terrible chapters in Ottoman history, a wound that has never healed. By 1916 and 1917, the wider war was going badly for the empire. British forces were pushing north through Mesopotamia, seizing Baghdad in March of 1917. Another British force, aided by the famous Arab revolt led by Sheriff Hussein of Mecca and by Colonel T.E. Lawrence, pushed north through Palestine. Jerusalem fell to the British in December of 1917. Damascus fell in October of 1918. By that autumn, the empire was completely broken. The armies were in retreat everywhere. The economy was ruined. Famine was widespread. Millions had died. And on the 30th of October, 1918, Ottoman envoys signed an armistice aboard a British warship anchored off the island of Mudros. The war was over. And so, effectively, was the empire. Allied troops occupied Istanbul in November of 1918. Ottoman generals and politicians were arrested. Vast territories were carved up under a proposed treaty called the Treaty of Severs, which would have left the empire as little more than a small state in the middle of Anatolia, with much of even that territory placed under foreign control. It seemed that the 600-year-old story was truly at its end, but something remarkable happened. In the interior of Anatolia, a resistance began to gather. Its leader was that same young colonel from Gallipoli, now a general, Mustafa Kemal. He landed at Samsun on the Black Sea coast in May of 1919, officially sent as an inspector by the Ottoman government, but secretly determined to organize national resistance. He called the Turkish people, both civilian and military, to fight for their homeland. And they answered. What followed was the Turkish War of Independence from 1919 to 1923. Kemal's forces fought Greek armies in the west, French forces in the south, and Armenian forces in the east. Slowly, painfully, they prevailed. Foreign troops withdrew. The proposed Treaty of Severs was thrown out. A new treaty, the Treaty of Lausanne, was signed in July of 1923. It recognized the borders of a new Turkish state, roughly the shape of modern Turkey. And on the 29th of October, 1923, Mustafa Kemal declared the founding of the Republic of Turkey. He would become its first president, and he would take the surname Atatürk, which means father of the Turks. The Ottoman Sultanate had already been abolished, quietly, on the 1st of November, 1922. The last Sultan, Mehmed VI, boarded a British warship in the Bosphorus and sailed away into exile. He would die in Italy in 1926. The Ottoman Caliphate lingered a little longer, held by his cousin Abdülmecid II, but it too was abolished on the 3rd of March, 1924. All members of the House of Osman were sent into exile. The dynasty founded by that quiet, patient chieftain 7 centuries earlier had come, at last, to its end. Osman's descendants would live scattered across Europe, in Paris, London, Cairo, Beirut. Some would return to Turkey only decades later, when the exile laws were finally relaxed. And so, our long story reaches its close. 600 years, 36 sultans, 3 continents, countless wars, poems, mosques, prayers, marketplaces, whispers, and dreams. From the small hills of Surgut where Osman once rode, to the great domes of Istanbul that still watch over the Bosphorus today, the Ottoman story is one of the great human epics. Not only a story of conquest and power, but a story of coexistence, of tolerance and its failures, of art and law and quiet gardens, of families and children, and the ordinary lives of millions who lived under the shadow of the crescent. If you visit Istanbul today, if you walk beside the Suleymani Eye at dusk, if you sit in a small tea house in the Grand Bazaar and listen to the murmur of many languages around you, you can still feel the empire's long breath, not as ghost, but as memory, not as ruin, but as inheritance. Thank you for walking with me through these 10 quiet chapters. If this journey brought you rest, comfort, or a little sleep, please leave a gentle comment below, share this story with a friend who might need calm, and consider subscribing to walk with us through more long journeys through history. For now, let your breathing slow. Let your body soften. Let the domes and minarets of an old and beautiful empire dim gently into the quiet of night. Sleep well, sleep deeply, sleep in peace.